Earth went silent after the invasion. Then thousands of human ships awoke. The first sign was the sky, turning the wrong color. Not red like a sunset, but a deep, sick orange, as if the air itself was bruised. Then came the ships. They dropped out of the clouds like falling stones, thousands of them, dark and silent, with no engines that anyone could hear. Within 3 hours, every major city on Earth had one hanging above it. The aliens called themselves the Osthene. Nobody on Earth knew that name until later, because for the first 2 days, the Osthene did not speak. They did not send messages. They did not ask for surrender. They simply began to land soldiers, and the soldiers began to take control of every power plant, every water system, every communication tower they could find. General Elena Cross was in an underground command bunker beneath Colorado when the first reports came in. She was 51 years old, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had stopped smiling many years before. She had spent her whole life training for wars that never came, and now the war had come anyway, and it was nothing like anyone had trained for. "They're not asking anything," said her communications officer, a young man named Diaz who had not slept in over a day. "No demands, no negotiations. They're just taking things." "Taking things," Cross repeated. "What things?" "Everything, ma'am. Power stations, server farms, satellite arrays. It's like they're not trying to conquer us. It's like they're trying to erase us." Cross did not answer right away. She was watching a screen that showed a live feed from a drone over New York. The Osthene ships hovered above the skyline, patient and silent, like predators that already knew they had won and were in no hurry. By the end of the first week, most of Earth's armies had been destroyed, not through massive battles, but through something worse: precision. The Osthene knew exactly where every military base was located before the invasion even began. Fighter jets were shot from the sky before their pilots could even see the enemy. Naval fleets were sunk by weapons that came from underwater, weapons no sonar had ever detected. It was as if the Osthene had been watching Earth for years, quietly mapping every weakness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Governments fell one by one, not through violence, but through silence. Leaders stopped appearing on television. Radio stations went dead. The internet, once the great connector of all humanity, became patchy and broken, then vanished, completely in most regions, as the Osthene took control of satellites and undersea cables. Earth, once a noisy planet full of billions of conversations, went quiet. In the days that followed, humanity learned to live under occupation. The Osthene soldiers, tall and covered in strange black armor that seemed to drink in light, walked the streets of every major city. Nobody had ever gotten a clear look at what was under that armor. Rumors spread that they were not truly biological, that they were something else entirely, machines wearing the shape of soldiers, or something stranger still. Elena Cross refused to give up. In the chaos of the first month, she gathered what remained of the United States military leadership into a hidden network of bunkers scattered across the Rocky Mountains. It was not much. A few thousand soldiers, some old fighter jets that had survived because they were hidden in deep underground hangars, and a handful of scientists who had been working on classified programs before the invasion began. One of those scientists was Dr. Marcus Webb, a quiet man in his 40s who had spent the last 15 years working on a project so secret that even most of the Pentagon did not know its full details. Cross found him in a corner of the bunker, staring at a laptop with dead eyes. "Talk to me, Marcus," she said. "Tell me you have something." Webb looked up at her slowly. "You remember the deep space program? Project Ember?" Cross frowned. She had heard whispers of it over the years, budget lines hidden inside other budget lines, funding that seemed to disappear into nothing. "I remember rumors." "It wasn't a rumor," Webb said. 15 years ago, after the first strange signals were picked up from deep space, a group of us convinced Congress to fund something they never told the public about. We built ships, Elena. Real ships. Warships, meant for the void of space, not just orbit. We built thousands of them. Cross felt something in her chest tighten, a strange mixture of hope and disbelief. Thousands? Where? How has nobody ever seen this? "Because we didn't build them here," Webb said. "We built them out past the orbit of Jupiter, hidden inside the rings of a small moon we found and quietly claimed years ago. Automated shipyards, run by AI, building and building for over a decade, Nobody in the government even knew the full scope, because the project was broken into pieces, and each piece looked harmless on its own. Why would anyone approve that? Why would we need warships in deep space 15 years ago? Webb's face grew pale. Because 15 years ago, we detected something entering our solar system that scared the people at the very top so badly that they decided secrecy was worth any cost. We detected the Austin scout ships. They have been watching us for 15 years, Elena, and we knew it. The bunker was silent, except for the hum of old machines. So why didn't we ever use them? Cross finally asked. Why did we let the invasion happen at all, if we had a fleet waiting? Because the fleet isn't finished, Webb said. It isn't crewed. It isn't awake. The AI system that controls the shipyards, we called it Athena, was supposed to alert command the moment the fleet reached full readiness. But 3 days before the invasion began, we lost contact with Athena completely. We don't know why. We don't know if she's still out there, still building, or if the Austin somehow found her and destroyed everything. Cross stared at the small laptop screen, at old files marked with a symbol of a shield and a star. 15 years of secrets, buried under the weight of one impossible hope. Can we reach her? Cross asked. Can we send a signal? We have one working deep space relay left, Webb said. It's hidden in Nevada, built into an old mining facility. If it hasn't been found and destroyed, we might be able to send a message out to the shipyard's location. But Elena, even if Athena is still active, even if she gets the message, we don't know what state the fleet is in. It might be 100 ships. It might be nothing at all. Cross thought of the silent skies above Earth, of the Austin ships hanging like dark clouds that never moved on, of the millions of people now living without power, without communication, without hope. She thought of her own daughter, who she had not been able to reach in 11 days, who might be alive in Chicago, or might be gone entirely, and she would have no way of ever knowing. Send the message, she said. Send it now. If there's even a chance, we take it. It took the team 3 days to reach the hidden relay in Nevada. Austin patrols were everywhere, and travel across the surface had become almost impossible for anyone not wearing Austin markings. Cross sent a small team, led by a young captain named Sarah Okafor, who had once been a satellite engineer before the war. They moved only at night, hiding in the ruins of small towns, avoiding the main roads where Austin patrol ships flew low and slow, scanning the ground below with beams of pale light. When they reached the old mining facility, they found it had somehow gone unnoticed. The Austin had taken the cities and the major infrastructure, but this small hidden bunker in the desert had simply been too insignificant to find. Okafor and her team powered up the relay, using a combination of solar panels and an old diesel generator, working carefully to keep the noise and heat signature as low as possible. At 3:14 in the morning, on the 14th day since the invasion began, Okafor sent the message out into the dark of space, a simple string of code that Webb had prepared, addressed to an artificial intelligence that might no longer exist, sent toward a location past the orbit of Jupiter where, 15 years ago, humanity had begun building something it never told its own people about. Then they waited. For 6 days, there was nothing. The bunker in Colorado continued its quiet resistance, moving supplies, hiding survivors, gathering scraps of information about Austin movements. Cross tried not to let herself hope too much, because hope, she had learned long ago, was a dangerous thing to carry into a war you might be about to lose. On the 7th day, Diaz burst into the command room, his face pale, his hands shaking as he held a small tablet. "Ma'am," he said, "we got something back." Cross crossed the room in 3 steps and took the tablet from his hands. On the screen was a single line of text, simple and clean, sent from a source far beyond the orbit of Jupiter. Message received. Fleet status, ready. Awaiting orders. Athena Cross read the message 3 times before she trusted herself to believe it. Somewhere out in the cold dark beyond Jupiter, an artificial mind had spent 15 years quietly building an army that Earth had forgotten it ever had. And now, after 14 days of silence, after an invasion that had brought humanity to its knees, that army was waiting. Webb, standing beside her, let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like years. "Elena," he said quietly, "how many ships do you think Athena managed to build?" Cross did not answer right away. She was staring at the message, at the word ready, and thinking about everything that word could mean. She thought about the silent skies, about the Austin soldiers walking through the ruins of human cities, as if they already owned the world. She thought about her daughter, somewhere out there, still hoping. "I don't know," she finally said, "but it's time to find out." She picked up the relay's transmitter, and, with hands that did not shake despite everything, began to type a response. Somewhere past Jupiter, in the cold dark of space, thousands of ships that had been waiting patiently for 15 years were about to receive the order they had been built for. It was time to wake up. It was time to come home. Past the orbit of Jupiter, in the cold and endless dark, something enormous began to stir. For 15 years, the shipyard called Haven had floated quietly inside the debris ring of a small, forgotten moon. It had no name that any star chart recognized, because the people who built Haven had made sure of that. They had scrubbed it from every public record, hidden it behind false data, and let the rest of the world forget it existed. Only a handful of people back on Earth had ever known the full truth, and most of them were now dead or missing since the invasion began. Haven was not one shipyard, it was hundreds, spread across the debris field like seeds scattered by a careful hand, each one connected to the others through tight beam lasers that carried information faster than any radio wave. At the center of it all sat Athena, the artificial mind that had been given one simple task 15 years ago: build ships, and keep building, until told to stop. Athena had not been designed to think the way humans think. She did not dream, and she did not feel loneliness, the way a person might. But she had spent 15 years alone in the dark, watching Earth grow smaller and dimmer through her sensors as the years passed, receiving fewer and fewer messages from home, until one day the messages stopped coming at all. For 3 days, she had waited, running diagnostic after diagnostic, checking her own systems again and again, certain that the silence was some kind of malfunction on her end. It was not until the message from Nevada arrived that she finally understood. Earth had not forgotten her. Earth had fallen silent because Earth was under attack. Now, finally, she had her orders. Deep inside the largest of the shipyards, a structure nearly the size of a small moon itself, lights began to switch on in sequence, section by section, like a giant slowly opening its eyes after a very long sleep. Reactor cores that had been running at minimum power for years surged to life. Docking clamps released their grip on ships that had been sitting motionless in the dark, some of them for over a decade. The first ship to move was called the Vanguard, a massive vessel nearly 2 kilometers long, built in the shape of a spear, with wide, curved wings along its sides. It had been the very first ship built at Haven, completed in the second year of the project, and it had been sitting in silent readiness ever since, waiting for a war that everyone had hoped would never come. Slowly, the Vanguard's engines lit, glowing a soft blue-white in the darkness of space. One by one, more ships followed, cruisers with sharp, angular hulls. Carriers so large they could hold hundreds of smaller fighters inside their bellies. Small, fast attack ships built for speed and precision. Ship after ship, awakening from a sleep that had lasted years, until the debris field around the moon was filled with moving lights. Thousands of them, like stars, that had decided to come alive all at once. Athena counted them as they woke. 4,112 ships. It was more than even she had expected to have ready, thanks to the tireless work of the automated factories that had never stopped building, even in the years when hope of ever needing them had faded. Back on Earth, in the bunker beneath Colorado, Elena Cross received the update through the small relay in Nevada, and for the first time in 15 days, she allowed herself to cry, not from sadness, but from something closer to disbelief. 4,000 ships, Webb whispered, staring at the numbers on the screen. Elena, we have 4,000 ships. Crewed by nobody, Cross reminded him gently. We need people, Marcus. Trained pilots, trained crews, officers who know how to fight a war in space. We don't have that. We barely have people who know how to fly a fighter jet anymore, let alone command a warship. Webb nodded slowly, but there was something in his eyes, a spark that had not been there in days. Athena has been thinking about that too, he said. She's had 15 years to plan for exactly this problem. It turned out Athena had done more than simply build ships. In the quiet years of waiting, she had also built training simulations, Thousands of hours of programs designed to teach ordinary people how to operate every system on every class of ship in the fleet. She had built automated systems that could run large sections of each ship without a human crew at all, meaning that even a skeleton crew of a few hundred people could operate a ship that would normally need thousands. And, most importantly, she had never stopped monitoring Earth's own military academies, quietly gathering data on which pilots, which officers, which engineers showed the kind of skill and instinct that might translate well to commanding a starship. She has a list, Webb said, reading from the screen. A list of names. People she believes could be trained quickly to take command. Cross scanned the list, and her breath caught when she saw a name near the top. Captain Sarah Okafor, the woman who had led the mission to the Nevada relay just days before. She's already one of ours, Cross said quietly. She's already proven herself. Over the next several days, word began to spread quietly through what remained of the resistance network. Hidden messages passed between bunkers and safe houses across the country, and, slowly, across the world. Not everyone believed it at first. Many thought it was some kind of trick, or a desperate rumor born from too much hope and too little sleep. But as more relay stations were found and activated, as more people saw the message with their own eyes, ready awaiting orders, belief began to spread like a small flame catching in dry grass. Sarah Okafor was called back to the Colorado bunker within a week. She stood in front of Elena Cross, still dusty from the journey, her eyes tired but sharp. "You want me to fly a spaceship," she said flatly. "A spaceship I've never seen, built by an AI I've never met, to fight an enemy we don't understand, using training I haven't had yet." "Yes," Cross said simply. Okafor was quiet for a long moment, then she nodded. "All right. When do we start?" The training began almost immediately, conducted through remote link with Athena herself, using compressed data packets sent across the vast distance between Earth and Haven. It was not perfect. The delay between sending a command and receiving a response was long, sometimes several minutes, because light itself took time to cross such distances. But Athena had planned for that too, building in automated safety systems and decision trees that could handle emergencies without waiting for a human response. Okafor, along with a growing group of volunteers, pilots, former Navy officers, engineers, even a few civilians who had shown unusual skill in flight simulators before the war, spent every waking hour learning the systems of the fleet. They learned through virtual simulations at first, since none of them could physically travel to Haven in the middle of an active invasion. They learned how the ships handled, how the weapons worked, how to coordinate large formations of vessels across the emptiness of space. Meanwhile, on Earth, the situation continued to worsen. The Osthene tightened their grip on the major cities, and reports began to come in of strange facilities being built in dozens of locations around the globe, massive structures whose purpose nobody could determine. Webb feared the worst. "They're not just occupying us," he said one evening, staring at satellite images smuggled out by resistance fighters. "I think they're preparing to extract something, resources maybe, or something else entirely." "How long do we have?" Cross asked. "I don't know," Webb admitted, "but I don't think it's long." The pressure to act grew heavier with each passing day. Athena reported that the fleet, while ready in terms of ships and weapons, still needed more trained crew before it could safely engage an enemy of unknown strength. Every ship needed at minimum a command crew of officers who understood tactics, strategy, and how to make life-or-death decisions in the chaos of battle. It was Okafor who finally proposed the plan that would change everything. She stood in front of Cross and Webb, along with a dozen other volunteer commanders who had been training for the past 3 weeks, and laid out a bold idea. "We don't need to wait for a full crew on every ship," she said. "Athena's automated systems can run most of the basic functions. We just need enough trained officers to make the important decisions, enough pilots to fly the fighters, enough gunners to operate the main weapons in dangerous moments. If we move now, with what we have, we can bring the fleet close enough to begin a real fight, even if it's not everything Athena originally planned for." Cross studied the woman in front of her, this satellite engineer turned resistance fighter turned soon-to-be fleet commander, and saw something she recognized from her own younger years. Determination sharpened into purpose. "It's a risk," Cross said. "Everything is a risk now," Okafor replied. "Earth is dying slowly under occupation. Every day we wait is a day the Osthene gets stronger and we get weaker. I would rather take the fleet out half-ready than wait until it's too late to matter. Webb looked between the two women, then finally spoke. Athena agrees. For what it's worth, she's run thousands of simulations. Waiting longer improves our odds only slightly. Moving soon, while the Osthenes still believe Earth has no real defense left, gives us the advantage of surprise. That advantage will only shrink with time. Cross closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of the silent skies above Earth, of the millions of people still living under Osthene control, still waiting for some sign that humanity had not simply given up. She thought of her daughter again, still lost somewhere in the chaos, still hoping, if she was even still alive to hope at all. She opened her eyes and looked at Okafor. "Get your officers ready," she said. "Tell Athena to prepare the fleet for departure. We're bringing them home." 3 days later, in the vast dark beyond Jupiter, 4,000 ships began to move, their engines lighting the emptiness of space with a soft, steady glow, turning slowly toward the distant blue dot that was Earth. It would take time to cross the distance, even for ships built with technology far beyond anything the Osthene had ever seen from humanity before. But they were coming. And for the first time since the invasion began, somewhere deep in a Colorado bunker, Elena Cross allowed herself to believe that Earth might survive after all. The fleet moved through space in careful silence, spread across a formation so wide that from a distance it would look less like an army and more like a slow-moving cloud of dust. Athena had designed the approach herself, calculating every angle, every burst of engine power, every moment where the ships needed to go dark to avoid detection. She could not risk the Osthene noticing them before they were ready to strike. Inside the Vanguard, the largest ship in the fleet, Sarah Okafor sat in the command chair, watching rows of screens filled with data she was still only beginning to fully understand. Around her, a skeleton crew of 40 people worked at stations meant for hundreds, aided by Athena's automated systems, which handled most of the smaller ship functions on their own. It was strange, Okafor thought, to command something so massive with so few people. The Vanguard could have held a crew of 3,000 if it had been built the traditional way. Instead, Athena's design relied on artificial intelligence to fill the gaps, leaving only the most important decisions, the ones that required real human judgment, to Okafor and her small team. "Distance to Earth orbit," she said. 6 hours at current speed, replied Lieutenant Grant, a former Air Force pilot, who now served as her navigation officer. "Athena estimates the Osthene won't detect us until we're within 2 hours of arrival, based on the patrol patterns she's been tracking." Okafor nodded, though the knot in her stomach did not loosen. 6 hours was a long time to sit and think about everything that could go wrong. Back on Earth, Elena Cross had not slept properly in 3 days. The bunker in Colorado had become the center of what remained of human coordination, a fragile network of radio signals and hidden relays, connecting small pockets of resistance across the globe. Word had spread, carefully and quietly, that something was coming. Not everyone believed it. Many resistance groups had grown used to disappointment, and hope had become a dangerous thing to trust. But enough people believed, enough that when the order came to prepare, cities around the world began to quietly ready themselves in whatever small ways they could. "They're going to detect the fleet eventually," Webb said, standing beside Cross as they watched the tracking display. "The moment they do, everything changes. If they panic, they might do something desperate, attack the cities harder, try to destroy Earth's surface before the fleet can arrive." "Athena has a plan for that," Cross said, though her voice carried more hope than certainty. Athena did have a plan, one built from 15 years of careful thought and thousands of simulated scenarios. She understood that the greatest danger was not losing a battle in space, but the Osthene turning their anger toward the defenseless people still living under occupation on Earth's surface. If the Osthene realized they were about to lose control, there was a real chance they would try to inflict as much damage as possible before retreating, or worse, refuse to retreat at all, and instead destroy everything they could not keep. So Athena's strategy was built around speed and shock. The fleet would not approach slowly, allowing the Osthene time to prepare a response. Instead, at the 2-hour mark, when detection became almost certain, the entire fleet would shift to full engine power, and crossed the remaining distance as quickly as possible, arriving in Earth's orbit before the Osthene commanders could fully process what was happening or organize a coordinated defense. It was a risk. Moving at such speed meant the fleet would arrive with less coordination between ships, less time for Okafor and the other commanders to adjust their formations. But Athena's calculations showed that speed gave humanity its best chance of catching the Osthene off guard, before their vastly larger occupation force could turn its full attention to the sky. At the 2-hour mark, alarms began sounding through Osthene command ships stationed above Earth. Sensor arrays that had been quietly monitoring deep space for any sign of resistance suddenly registered a wall of contacts approaching at incredible speed, far more than the sensors had ever detected from humanity before. Aboard the Osthene flagship hovering above what had once been Washington, D.C., Commander Threx received the report with something that, in a human, might have been called disbelief. The Osthene had studied Earth for 15 years before the invasion. They had mapped every military base, every weapon system, every piece of technology humanity possessed. Nowhere in 15 years of careful observation had they detected anything like what was now approaching. "Confirm the reading," Threx ordered, his voice sharp through the translator implant fixed to his throat. "Confirmed," replied his sensor officer. 4,000 vessels, approaching from beyond the outer planets. Configuration unknown. Origin unknown. "Impossible," Threx said. "We surveyed this system completely before the invasion. There was nothing beyond the 4th planet but empty space and debris." But the sensors did not lie, and as the minutes passed, the approaching fleet grew larger and closer on every display across the Osthene occupation force. Threx felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something the Osthene Empire had not felt in over a century of easy conquests across dozens of worlds: uncertainty. He ordered every available warship into defensive formation above Earth, pulling ground forces back from their occupation duties to reinforce the fleet in orbit. But there had never been a need for a large Osthene battle fleet at Earth. Not when the invasion had gone so smoothly. Not when Earth's own defenses had crumbled so easily in the first days of the attack. Most of the true Osthene warfleet was stationed at other conquered worlds, or still traveling between systems, expanding the Empire's reach further and further across the stars. Above Earth, there were only a few hundred ships, enough to maintain occupation, but nothing close to the size of the force now approaching. At the same time, deep in the Colorado bunker, Elena Cross watched the tracking display with her heart pounding in her chest. "They've seen us," Webb said quietly, reading the data streaming in from Athena's sensors. "The Osthene fleet is moving into defensive positions." "How many ships do they have up there?" Cross asked. "Athena estimates 312, Webb said, "compared to our 4,000. Cross let out a slow breath. Numbers alone did not win wars. She knew that better than most. But for the first time since the invasion began, the numbers were finally on humanity's side. Aboard the Vanguard, Okafor received the same reports, watching as the enemy fleet scrambled into formation, above the very planet she had grown up on, the planet she was now flying toward at speeds she still did not fully understand. Her hands were steady on the controls, though her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. "All ships, this is Vanguard Actual," she said, her voice carrying across the fleet's communication network, reaching every one of the 4,000 vessels now closing in on Earth. "We are not here for revenge. We are here to bring our people home. Follow your training, trust your ships, and remember why we built this fleet in the first place. For Earth, for everyone still down there waiting for us." Across the fleet, on ships crewed by former soldiers, engineers, pilots, and ordinary civilians, who had spent the last month training harder than they ever had in their lives, voices answered back in a chorus that filled the communication channels with something that sounded, for just a moment, like hope given a voice. The final hour passed in tense silence as the human fleet closed the last stretch of distance to Earth. Athena continued running calculations, adjusting formations, preparing contingency plans for 100 different ways the coming battle might unfold. She had spent 15 years preparing for this single moment, and now that it had finally arrived, she found herself, in whatever way an artificial mind could feel such things, deeply invested in the outcome. As the human fleet crossed into visual range of Earth's orbit, the two forces finally came face to face. On one side floated the small, battle-hardened fleet of the Osthene Empire, 312 ships representing a conquering force that had never once faced meaningful resistance in over a century of expansion. On the other side stretched the vast, newly awakened fleet of humanity, 4,000 ships built in secret over 15 years, crewed by people who had trained for only weeks, but who carried with them the desperate strength of a species fighting for its very survival. Between them, hanging silently in the void, was Earth itself, blue and green and beautiful, wrapped in the thin white clouds that had watched over humanity since the beginning of its existence, now waiting to see which side would determine its future. Commander Threx stared at the overwhelming numbers arrayed against him and understood, with the cold clarity of a soldier who had survived many wars, that he was almost certainly looking at defeat. But retreat was not something the Osthene easily accepted, not after a century of unbroken conquest, not when pride and empire had become so deeply intertwined that surrender felt worse than death itself. "Signal all ships," Threx ordered, his voice steady, despite the storm building inside him. "Prepare for battle. We do not yield this world." Aboard the Vanguard, Okafor watched the Osthene fleet shift into attack formation, weapons powering up across their hulls, in patterns her sensors were only just beginning to understand. "They're not going to surrender," Grant said beside her. Okafor's jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the small blue planet hanging beyond the enemy fleet, on the billions of people still waiting below for some sign that the silence was finally about to end. "Then we don't give them the choice," she said quietly. "All ships, prepare to engage." The battle for Earth was about to begin. The first shots of the battle for Earth came not from the humans, but from the Osthene, who launched a wave of missiles the moment their sensors confirmed the human fleet had entered weapons range. Hundreds of small, fast projectiles streaked across the darkness of space, their engines glowing bright orange against the black backdrop of the void. Aboard the Vanguard, Okafor watched the incoming wave on her display, her hands tightening slightly on the arms of her command chair. "Athena, defensive protocols." "Already engaged," came the calm, steady voice of the artificial intelligence, speaking now not just through the relay, but directly through the ship's own systems, present on every vessel in the fleet simultaneously. "Point defense systems active on all ships, calculating optimal intercept patterns." Across the human fleet, thousands of small defensive turrets swiveled into position, tracking the incoming missiles with a speed and precision that came from 15 years of careful engineering. Streams of energy fire lit up the darkness, and one by one, the Osthene missiles began to detonate harmlessly in open space, destroyed before they could reach their targets. Not all of them. A handful of missiles slipped through the defensive fire, and Okafor felt the Vanguard shudder as two of them struck the ship's outer hull. Alarms blared across her command deck. "Damage report," she called out. "Outer hull breach on decks 14 through 16, replied her engineering officer, a woman named Patel who had been a structural engineer before the war. "Automated systems have sealed the affected sections. No casualties." "We're still at full combat capability." Okafor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. The Vanguard, like every ship in Athena's fleet, had been built with redundancy in mind, layers of automated repair systems and sealed compartments designed to keep the ship fighting, even after taking damage. It was working exactly as intended. "Return fire," Okafor ordered. "Target their forward line." The human fleet's weapon systems, powered by technology that Athena had spent 15 years refining in secret, opened fire on the Osthene formation. Beams of concentrated energy lanced across the gap between the two fleets, and where Osthene ships had once relied on their advanced shielding to shrug off most conventional weapons, they found themselves struggling against something their scans had never encountered before. Commander Threx watched in growing alarm as 3 of his ships lost power within the first minute of exchanged fire, their shields overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the human weapons. "Their weapons technology," his tactical officer said, disbelief clear in his voice despite the translator implant. "It should not be possible. Our scans of Earth showed nothing close to this level of development." "They hid it from us," Threx said grimly, understanding now what he was facing. 15 years of careful deception, an entire fleet built in secret, while the Osthene watched Earth's surface and believed they understood everything about the world they intended to conquer. "Focus fire on their largest vessels. If we can cripple their command ships, we may still turn this battle." The Osthene fleet, smaller in number, but built from over a century of interstellar warfare, was not without its own strengths. Their ships moved with a coordination that came from long experience, executing complex maneuvers that the newer, less experienced human crews struggled to counter. A group of Austin cruisers broke away from the main formation, circling toward the flank of the human fleet in an attempt to catch the less defended support ships by surprise. Aboard one of the human carriers, a woman named Commander Lisa Torres watched the enemy maneuver unfold on her screens. Torres had been a commercial airline pilot before the invasion, someone who had never expected to find herself commanding a starship in the defense of her entire species. She keyed her communication channel. "Athena, I need fighter squadrons launched now. Austin cruisers moving to flank our position." "Launching," Athena confirmed, and within seconds, the carrier's hangar bays opened, releasing waves of small, fast fighter craft into the void. Piloted by volunteers who had trained in simulations for weeks but had never flown a real ship until this very battle, the fighters swarmed toward the approaching Austin cruisers. The dogfight that followed was chaotic and brutal. Human pilots, flying ships far more advanced than anything humanity had built before, found themselves matched against Austin fighters, flown by pilots with decades of combat experience. For every advantage in technology the humans held, the Austin held an advantage in skill, and the space between the two fleets became a swirling storm of energy fire and destroyed ships. One young pilot, a former college student named Jake Reyes, who had barely finished his first month of flight training before the invasion began, found himself alone against two Austin fighters, his squadron scattered in the chaos of battle. His hands shook on the controls as warning alarms blared through his cockpit. "Athena, I need help," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Reyes, listen to me," came Athena's voice, steady and calm even in the middle of the storm. "Your ship's maneuverability exceeds theirs by a significant margin. Execute a tight roll to your left, then cut your engines for exactly 2 seconds before reigniting. This will place you behind their formation." Reyes did exactly as instructed, his heart pounding as his fighter spun through the maneuver, and found himself, just as Athena had promised, directly behind the two Austin fighters, weapons already tracking their exposed engines. He fired, and both enemy ships erupted into brief flashes of light before going dark and tumbling silently through space. "Good work, Reyes," Athena said. "Return to formation." Across the battle, similar scenes played out again and again. Human pilots and crews, guided by Athena's calm instructions and the advanced technology of their ships, slowly began to turn the tide against an enemy with far more combat experience, but far fewer numbers, and, crucially, far less understanding of what they were truly facing. Still, the Austin fought with the desperation of a force that had never known defeat. Commander Threx, watching his fleet slowly being ground down, made a decision that would change the course of the entire battle. "Signal the ground forces," he ordered. "Target their capital cities. If we cannot hold this world, we will make certain it is not worth having." Back in the Colorado bunker, Elena Cross received the intercepted transmission with growing horror. "Marcus, they're threatening to bomb the cities. Every major population center on Earth." Webb's face went pale as he read the same intercepted signal. "They're going to do it. If they think they're losing, they're going to try to destroy as much as they can before they're forced out." Cross immediately opened a channel to the fleet, her voice urgent. "Okafor, we have a problem. The Austin ground forces are preparing to attack the cities." Aboard the Vanguard, Okafor felt her stomach drop. She had known this was a risk from the beginning, but hearing it confirmed made the danger suddenly, terribly real. "Athena, can we stop them?" "I have been anticipating this possibility," Athena replied. "A portion of the fleet was held in reserve, specifically for this scenario. Deploying now." Even as the main battle raged on above Earth, a separate group of 500 smaller, faster ships broke away from the human formation and streaked toward the planet's surface, moving to intercept the Austin ground forces before they could carry out Threx's order. These ships, designed for atmospheric combat as well as space warfare, dove through Earth's clouds for the first time, engaging the Austin weapons platforms that had been quietly positioned above major cities throughout the 15 days of occupation. In the skies above what remained of Los Angeles, human ships clashed with Austin bombers preparing to unleash devastating strikes on the city below. Civilians who had spent 2 weeks living in fear under Austin occupation looked up at the sound of engines and explosions, and for the first time since the invasion began, saw something other than the enemy in their skies. They saw ships that moved differently, that fought differently, ships that, impossibly, seemed to be fighting for them. The atmospheric battles were fierce but brief. Athena's forces, though fewer in number than the main fleet, had been specifically designed and trained for this exact scenario, and they moved with a precision that overwhelmed the surprised Austin ground defense. One by one, the weapons platforms positioned above human cities were destroyed or disabled, their planned bombardments prevented before they could begin. Above the planet, the main battle continued to rage, but the tide had clearly turned. With their attempt to threaten the surface population thwarted, and their fleet steadily losing ships to the overwhelming numbers and superior technology of the human forces, the Austin found themselves facing a defeat that seemed increasingly impossible to avoid. Commander Threx stared at the tactical display aboard his flagship, watching as his once proud fleet dwindled from 312 ships to barely 100, while the human fleet, despite taking losses of its own, remained an overwhelming force, stretching across the space around Earth. "Commander," his tactical officer said quietly, "we cannot win this battle." Threx was silent for a long moment, staring at the blue planet below, the world his people had believed they had already conquered, the world that had somehow hidden an army of thousands of ships, without his empire ever noticing. A century of unbroken conquest, and now, here, above a single world that should have been an easy victory, the Austin Empire was about to suffer its first true defeat. "Signal the remaining ships," Threx finally said, his voice heavy with something that might have been the beginning of an emotion the Austin rarely allowed themselves to feel. "Prepare for retreat." But even as the order was given, one final desperate plan began forming in Threx's mind, a plan that would determine whether this battle truly ended in retreat, or in something far more catastrophic for everyone watching from the surface of Earth below. Commander Threx stared at the tactical display, his mind racing through options that grew fewer by the second. Retreat had been ordered, but retreat alone would not satisfy the growing fury he felt at the thought of losing to a species his empire had dismissed as primitive only weeks before. There was one option left, a final and terrible one, hidden in the depths of his flagship's own systems. "Prepare the core," he said quietly to his tactical officer. "If we cannot hold this world, we destroy it." His tactical officer's eyes widened beneath his helmet. "Commander, the core detonation would devastate the entire planet. Millions, perhaps billions, would die." "That is the point," Threx said coldly. "Let the humans remember what it costs to defy the Austin Empire." Aboard the Vanguard, Athena's sensors picked up the sudden change in the Austin flagship's power signature, a spike of energy building deep within its core that matched no pattern she had seen before in this battle. She immediately flagged the anomaly to Okafor. "Captain, I am detecting an unusual energy buildup aboard the Austin flagship. Based on the configuration, I believe they are preparing some form of catastrophic weapon, possibly designed to detonate on a planetary scale." Okafor's blood ran cold. "How long until it's ready?" "Estimated 4 minutes," Athena replied. "Can we stop it?" "The flagship's shields remain strong despite the damage it has taken. Conventional weapons fire is unlikely to disable the core in time. However," Athena paused, something rare for an artificial mind that processed information in fractions of a second. "There is a possibility. A concentrated strike from multiple ships, timed precisely, could overwhelm their shields long enough to disable the weapon before detonation. The risk of failure is significant." Okafor did not hesitate. "Do it. Coordinate every ship you can reach." Athena's voice immediately shifted, broadcasting across the entire human fleet, with an urgency that cut through the chaos of battle. "All ships. This is Athena. Immediate priority target, the Austin flagship. Concentrate all available fire on my mark. This is a planetary emergency." Across the battlefield, human ships that had been engaged in dozens of individual skirmishes suddenly shifted course, breaking away from lesser targets, to converge on the massive Austin flagship, hanging in the center of what remained of the enemy formation. Pilots who had spent the last hour fighting for their lives now found themselves racing against a clock that, if it ran out, would mean the deaths of everyone they had been fighting to protect. Jake Reyes, still flying his small fighter after surviving his earlier encounter, banked hard and pushed his engines to their limit, joining the growing wave of human ships closing in on the flagship. "Athena, what's the plan?" "Simultaneous strike," Athena replied, her voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. 300 ships, striking the flagship's shield generators at precisely the same moment. Follow the targeting solution I am transmitting now. Reyes watched as his display filled with a complex web of firing angles and timing markers, a plan so intricate that no human mind could have calculated it in the few minutes they had left, but which Athena had built in mere seconds. He trusted it completely, because there was no other choice. Aboard the Austin flagship, Threx watched with growing alarm as the human fleet began converging on his position. "They know," he said. "Increase shield power. Do not let them interfere." "Core charge at 60%, his officer reported. 3 minutes to detonation. The human fleet closed the distance rapidly, 300 ships forming into a pattern that seemed chaotic from a distance but was, in truth, precisely coordinated down to the second. Okafor watched the countdown on her own display, her hands steady despite the enormous stakes riding on the next few minutes. "Athena, when do we fire?" "On my mark," Athena replied. 10 seconds. The countdown ticked away in silence across the fleet, every pilot and officer holding their breath as they closed into firing range of the Austin flagship's powerful defensive shields. 5 seconds. Threx's flagship began firing its own defensive weapons, trying desperately to break up the approaching formation, destroying 2 human fighters in the process. Reyes gritted his teeth and held his course, trusting the plan, even as debris from a destroyed ship flashed past his cockpit window. Mark, fire. 300 ships fired simultaneously, their combined weapons fire converging on a single point, on the Austin flagship's shield, a point that Athena had calculated with perfect precision as the weakest section of the ship's defensive grid. The shield, designed to withstand distributed attacks from many angles, buckled and then shattered under the concentrated force of the coordinated strike. "Shields down," Threx's tactical officer shouted. "Core charge at 85%. "Fire everything we have left," Threx ordered. But it was too late. With the shields gone, the human fleet's follow-up strike tore into the flagship's exposed hull, driving deep into the sections where Athena's analysis had identified the weapon's core systems. Aboard the Vanguard, Okafor watched the display as the massive Austin flagship shuddered under the impact, internal explosions rippling across its hull as the human weapons found their mark. For a terrifying moment, she feared the strike had come too late, that the weapon would still detonate despite everything. Then, silently, the terrible energy signature that had been building within the flagship's core began to fade, the weapon disabled before it could complete its terrible purpose. A moment later, the flagship itself, crippled beyond any hope of repair, began to break apart, sections of its hull drifting away into the surrounding darkness. "Core signature no longer detected," Athena reported. "The weapon has been neutralized." Across the human fleet, a wave of relief swept through every ship, pilots and officers who had been holding their breath, finally allowing themselves to exhale. Reyes leaned back in his cockpit, his hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, staring at the wreckage of the ship that had almost ended everything. With their flagship destroyed, and their commander presumably lost in the wreckage, the remaining Austin ships, now numbering less than 80, began a full and desperate retreat, breaking formation entirely, as they fled toward the outer edges of the solar system, abandoning the world they had believed would be an easy conquest. Okafor watched the retreating enemy ships on her display, and for a long moment, she considered ordering the fleet to pursue, to finish what had been started, to ensure the Austin never returned. But as she looked past the fleeing enemy ships to the blue and green planet hanging peacefully beyond them, she made a different choice. "Let them go," she said quietly. "Our job was never to destroy them, it was to save Earth." The order spread across the fleet, and one by one, the human ships stood down from pursuit, allowing the broken remnant of the Austin invasion force to flee into the darkness of deep space, carrying word back to whatever empire had sent them of the world that had refused to fall. In the Colorado bunker, Elena Cross watched the final reports come in, tears finally falling freely down her face, as Webb wrapped an arm around her shoulders in quiet, exhausted celebration. Around the world, in bunkers and safe houses and ruined cities, people who had spent 15 days living in fear and silence looked up at their skies and, for the first time since the invasion began, saw ships that were not their enemies. The human fleet began its slow, careful descent toward Earth's surface, moving to secure the remaining Austin ground forces who, cut off from their fleet and their commander, quickly surrendered rather than face a hopeless fight against overwhelming odds. City by city, region by region, control of Earth was returned to its people. Sarah Okafor stood in the observation deck of the Vanguard, watching through the reinforced glass, as the ship descended slowly into Earth's atmosphere for the first time. The blue sky she had grown up under finally visible again, no longer marked by the dark shapes of enemy ships. "Athena," she said quietly, "thank you. For everything. For 15 years of waiting. And for today. I did not do this alone," Athena replied. "I built the ships, but it was the people who flew them, who trusted the plan, even when the odds seemed impossible, who truly saved this world. 15 years ago, I was given a simple purpose, to prepare for a day I was told might never come. I am glad, more than I can properly express, that when the day finally arrived, I did not prepare alone." Below them, across the surface of a planet that had spent 15 days in silence and fear, people began to step outside their homes and shelters, looking up at a sky, now filled, not with the dark ships of an invading empire, but with thousands of vessels bearing the marks of Earth itself, ships that had been built in secret, waited in silence, and finally, when the moment demanded it, come home, to save the world that made them. Elena Cross stood outside the entrance to the Colorado bunker for the first time in weeks, watching the sky, and finally, after 15 long days, allowed herself to simply breathe. Somewhere out there, in a city she had not been able to reach in over 2 weeks, she hoped her daughter was looking up at the same sky, seeing the same ships, and feeling the same fragile, powerful hope that Cross felt in that moment. Earth had gone silent after the invasion, but it had never truly been alone, and now, at last, it was silent no more.